Have you ever wondered what life was truly like for women nearly 9 centuries ago? Did they have choices? Did their voices matter? Were their lives truly their own? Journey with us back to 1145, a world far removed from our own, where the realities of female servitude were stark and often unimaginably bleak. Number 8. The unseen chains of domestic labor and constant drudgery. Imagine waking up every single day not to a gentle alarm, but to the first hint of dawn, or even earlier, before the sun has even thought about showing its face. For a woman in 1145, whether she was a peasant's daughter or a servant in a lord's manor, her day was not her own. Her existence was defined by a relentless cycle of tasks, an endless list of chores that kept her body in motion and her mind focused on survival, not on aspirations or personal dreams. This was not simply work. It was a servitude woven into the very fabric of her being, a constant physical and mental burden that rarely, if ever, offered respite. Consider the typical household, which was not the neat, efficient space we might envision today. It was a place where everything, from food preparation to clothing maintenance, was a monumental effort. There were no ready-made meals, no washing machines, no central heating. Every necessity required immense physical input. A woman's day might begin with fetching water from the communal well or a nearby stream, a task that, depending on the distance, could take a significant portion of the early morning. Imagine carrying heavy wooden buckets, often filled with 5 or more gallons, over uneven terrain, perhaps in the bitter cold or the scorching heat. This was not a one-time trip. Water was needed for cooking, for washing bodies, for cleaning clothes, and for preparing drinks. A single family, even a small one, would require multiple trips throughout the day, each one taxing on the shoulders and back. Then came the fire. Keeping a hearth burning was essential for warmth, for cooking, and for light during the long, dark hours. This meant gathering wood, often foraging for fallen branches in nearby forests or fields, or carrying bundles of peat, which was a dirty, laborious job. The smoke from these fires often filled the small, poorly ventilated homes, leading to chronic respiratory issues that would go undiagnosed and untreated for centuries. Cooking itself was an epic undertaking. There were no processed ingredients. Grains, the staple of most diets, had to be ground, a task often performed by women using heavy quernstones, a process that could take hours to produce enough flour for a single day's bread. Imagine the repetitive motion, the aching arms, the dust of the flour filling the air. Vegetables had to be cleaned, prepared, and cooked over an open flame or in heavy iron pots suspended over the fire. Meat, when available, needed butchering, salting, or smoking to preserve it. Every meal was a testament to hours of hard work, a testament to the woman's tireless efforts to nourish her family or the household she served. Historical accounts, such as those gleaned from monastic records detailing provisions for servants, hint at the sheer volume of ingredients that needed daily processing, far beyond the capabilities of a single person in a short time. Beyond the hearth, there was the constant battle against dirt and pests. Homes were typically made of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs, and were prone to dampness, vermin, and the accumulation of grime. Sweeping floors, often made of packed earth, was an endless task. Cleaning cooking utensils, which were typically heavy and cumbersome, involved scrubbing with sand or ashes, often in cold water. The care of clothing was another massive burden. There were no mass-produced textiles. Wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and then woven. This entire process, from sheep to garment, was frequently a female domain. Spinning, often done on a drop spindle, was a constant background activity, performed while walking, while talking, even while tending to children. It required dexterity and endless repetition. Washing clothes was an all-day event, typically done in a stream or river, involving beating the garments against stones, rinsing them repeatedly, and then laying them out to dry. This was a seasonal task, almost impossible in deep winter, meaning clothes were often worn for extended periods without washing. Then there was the care of children. Medieval families were large, and infant and child mortality rates were tragically high. A woman was often in a near constant state of pregnancy or nursing, while simultaneously caring for multiple young children. There was no concept of daycare, no ready-made formula, no disposable diapers. Every aspect of child rearing, from feeding to cleaning to comforting, fell squarely on her shoulders, even as she performed all her other domestic duties. Imagine attempting to grind grain or wash clothes with a toddler clinging to your skirt, or an infant strapped to your back. The relentless demands on her physical and emotional energy were immense, often leading to exhaustion that went beyond mere tiredness into a chronic state of depletion. For women in servitude within larger households, such as manors or castles, the tasks might differ in specific type, but not in intensity or volume. A scullery maid might spend her entire day scrubbing pots and pans, her hands raw from lye soap and cold water. A chambermaid would be responsible for cleaning the chambers of the lord and lady, which, despite their grandeur, still required meticulous and constant attention. A laundry maid might spend her days with scalding water and heavy linens. These roles were often assigned with little regard for personal preference or aptitude, and they were performed under the watchful eyes of superiors who could punish perceived slowness or inefficiency. Historical texts like the Household Book of Eleanor of Montfort, though slightly later, give glimpses into the precise and extensive duties expected of household servants, emphasizing the unceasing nature of their work. There were no weekends, no holidays, no sick days. Sickness or injury simply meant pain endured while still performing duties, or a complete loss of income and potential expulsion from the household. The reality was a life defined by physical exertion, endless repetition, and a complete lack of personal time or space, a servitude that consumed every waking hour and often invaded her dreams. Number 7, the vulnerability to violence and lack of legal protection. Imagine living in a world where your body, your very existence, was not truly your own. Where the sanctity of your person was a fragile concept, easily disregarded by those with power, and where the avenues for recourse were practically non-existent. For women in 1145, this was not a theoretical fear, but a daily reality. The structures of society, from the feudal lord to the head of the household, positioned women in a subordinate and highly vulnerable state. Their physical safety was often contingent on the whims of men, and the prevailing legal and social norms offered them little to no effective protection against physical, emotional, or sexual violence. This bleak reality permeated every layer of society, from the highest noblewoman to the lowliest serf. Within the household, domestic violence was widespread and largely unpunished. A husband's authority over his wife was almost absolute, often considered akin to a father's authority over his children, or a lord's over his vassals. While the church sometimes preached against excessive cruelty, the common understanding was that a husband had the right to chastise his wife, even physically, to ensure her obedience. This was often seen not as a crime, but as a necessary tool for maintaining order within the family unit. Records from manorial courts, though sparse for this early period, occasionally reveal instances where disputes over property or insults were brought forth, but rarely, if ever, direct accusations of a husband's physical abuse against his wife. If a wife did suffer severe injury, it was often attributed to an accident or simply ignored by the community. There was no social worker to call, no shelter to flee to, and little sympathetic ear from a male-dominated justice system. A woman who attempted to leave an abusive situation would face immediate social ostracization, destitution, and the potential loss of her children, who were considered the husband's property. Her options were essentially to endure or perish. Beyond the home, women were acutely vulnerable to sexual violence. The concept of female consent, as we understand it today, was largely absent. In a society where women were often viewed as property, of their fathers, then of their husbands, an assault was often considered a crime against the male guardian's property rights rather than a violation of the woman's bodily autonomy. The legal frameworks that existed were primitive and heavily skewed against the victim. For a woman to accuse a man of rape, she would often need witnesses, which were almost impossible to find given the nature of such crimes. Even if witnesses existed, her testimony alone was often deemed insufficient, especially if she was a woman of lower social standing and the accused was a man of higher status. Her reputation would be irrevocably tarnished, often more so than the perpetrator's. She might be accused of enticing the man, or even fabricating the accusation for malicious reasons. The shame and dishonor associated with sexual assault often fell entirely on the victim, leading many to suffer in silence rather than face further public humiliation and an almost certain lack of justice. Historical accounts, such as those found in early legal treatises like the Assize of Clarendon, though slightly later, it reflects the legal mindset, demonstrate how difficult it was for women to bring any charges successfully without male sponsorship and compelling evidence. Furthermore, women, particularly peasant women or those traveling alone, were vulnerable to the depredations of soldiers, bandits, or even their own lords. Times of war or unrest, which were frequent in 1145 during the period known as the Anarchy in England, women were often treated as spoils of war. Entire villages could be plundered, and women were subjected to brutal treatment without any hope of intervention or later justice. Even in peaceful times, the feudal system placed enormous power in the hands of the lord. A lord might demand sexual favors from his female tenants, often under the guise of the droit du seigneur, though its actual widespread practice as a formal right is debated by modern historians. The underlying power dynamic and abuse were very real. Resistance could mean eviction, destitution, or even physical violence against the woman and her family. The sheer power imbalance meant that many forms of exploitation were simply tolerated as part of the social order, unacknowledged as violence because the victim had no standing to define it as such. The lack of personal mobility for women further compounded their vulnerability. Women were generally not permitted to travel alone, and when they did, they faced immense dangers. A woman without a male escort was automatically suspect, often assumed to be a prostitute or vagrant, making her an easy target for abuse. Monasteries and convents, while offering a form of sanctuary, were not accessible to everyone and came with their own forms of strictures and limitations. For the vast majority of women, their world was circumscribed by their village, their household, and the limited movements allowed by their male guardians. Stepping outside these boundaries, either physically or socially, carried immense risks that were often met with violence and a complete absence of legal recourse. The reality was a pervasive atmosphere of fear, where a woman's body was never truly her own, and protection was a privilege, not a right, often granted or withheld at the discretion of men. Number 6, economic dependence and the chilling prospect of destitution. Imagine living in a world where your ability to put food on the table, to have a roof over your head, and to secure even the most basic necessities of life was almost entirely dependent on another person, specifically a man. For women in 1145, this was not just a theoretical concept, it was the bedrock of their daily existence. Their economic independence was practically non-existent, leaving them in a perpetual state of reliance on male relatives, and facing the terrifying prospect of utter destitution if those relationships failed or ended. This economic reality was a form of servitude itself, as it severely limited their choices, their mobility, and their very survival. The legal and social structures of the time ensured that women had minimal rights over property and income. In many parts of Europe, under various forms of feudal law and customary practices, women could not own land in their own right, especially if married. Any land they brought into a marriage, through dowry or inheritance, typically passed into the control of their husband. He had the legal right to manage or dispose of it, and any income derived from it was his to control. If a woman worked, say, in the fields alongside her husband, or as a domestic servant, her wages or the fruits of her labor were also legally considered to belong to her husband or father. This meant that a woman had no independent means of building wealth or even saving for herself. Her access to resources was always mediated through a male figure. Consider the life of a peasant woman. Her labor was essential for the survival of her family. She worked in the fields, sowing seeds, weeding crops, harvesting during grueling season. She cared for livestock, processed food, brewed ale, made candles, and spun wool. Yet, despite her immense contribution, she controlled none of the economic output. The harvest belonged to her husband, who in turn owed portions to the lord of the manor. Any surplus was his to trade or sell. If he squandered it, or if the harvest failed, she, along with her children, suffered the consequences without any power to intervene or change their economic circumstances. Scholars like Eileen Power, in her extensive work on medieval women, highlight how this economic dependence was a defining feature of female existence across social classes, making it a powerful tool of control. The most terrifying prospect for a woman was widowhood, especially for those without adult sons. While a widow might be legally entitled to a portion of her deceased husband's estate, often 1/3, known as dower rights, receiving this was frequently fraught with difficulty. She might face opposition from her husband's male relatives who wished to claim the land or property. If she had no sons, or if her sons were too young to take over, she might be seen as a burden, and her dower rights could be challenged or ignored. Without an adult male to manage the land or protect her interests, a widow was often vulnerable to exploitation, fraud, or simply being left with insufficient resources to survive. Many widows found themselves quickly remarried, not out of love, but out of necessity, as marrying a new husband was often the only way to secure protection and economic stability for herself and her children. This remarriage often came with its own set of challenges, subjecting her once again to a new male authority. For women who were never married or who were abandoned, their economic options were even more dire. Prostitution was often the only avenue for survival for many women in urban areas who lacked male support. While some might find work as domestic servants, this was a precarious existence, dependent on the goodwill of their employers and offering very low wages, if any, beyond board and lodging. There were few guilds or professions open to women, severely limiting their opportunities for skilled labor. Even women who practiced traditional female crafts, like brewing or baking, often did so within the context of a family business managed by a male head. Single women without familial support were often pushed to the very margins of society, vulnerable to starvation, homelessness, and further exploitation. Even women in convents, while seemingly escaping the direct control of a husband, were still economically dependent on the institution, which in turn relied on donations and endowments often made by powerful men. Their economic security was tied to the well-being of the convent, and they often had no personal income or property. This pervasive economic dependence was a constant shadow over a woman's life in 1145. It dictated her choices, constrained her freedom, and made the thought of defiance or independence a direct path to starvation and social ruin. Her servitude was not just to a person, but to a system that denied her the most fundamental means of self-sustenance. Number 5, the perilous cycle of childbirth and high mortality rates. Imagine a life where the very act of bringing new life into the world was fraught with such immense danger that it was often seen as a near certain gateway to your own death. This was the stark, terrifying reality for women in 1145. Childbirth was not just a joyous occasion, it was a leading cause of female mortality, a relentless cycle of pregnancy, labor, and often devastating loss that overshadowed a woman's entire adult life. This constant proximity to death, coupled with the high mortality rates for infants and young children, created a bleak reality that deeply impacted a woman's physical and emotional well-being. It was a servitude to her biological function, a sacrifice demanded by nature and societal expectation. From the moment a woman reached puberty and was likely married, she entered a period of almost continuous fertility. Limited knowledge of contraception, and often a societal expectation to bear many children, women experienced repeated pregnancies throughout their childbearing years. Imagine being pregnant for much of your adult life, your body constantly undergoing immense physical changes and strain. Pregnancy in 1145 was not a time of pampered care or specialized medical attention. Women continued to perform their arduous daily labors, whether in the fields or in the home, often until the very onset of labor. There was little understanding of nutrition during pregnancy, and widespread malnutrition meant that women were often physically depleted even before the challenges of childbirth began. When labor began, it was a terrifying ordeal. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors in the modern sense, and certainly no sophisticated medical interventions. Childbirth was almost exclusively handled by other women, often an elderly woman known as a midwife, whose knowledge was based on generations of practical experience, superstition, and traditional remedies. While some midwives were undoubtedly skilled, their tools were basic, their understanding of anatomy limited, and hygiene practices virtually non-existent. Imagine giving birth in a small, crowded home, perhaps on a dirt floor, surrounded by smoke and the smells of everyday life. There were no pain relief options, only the stoic endurance of unimaginable pain. Complications like prolonged labor, hemorrhage, infection, or a difficult presentation of the baby often led to tragic outcomes for both mother and child. Accounts from the period, while not always explicit medical records, frequently mention women dying in childbirth, underscoring its commonality. The risk of puerperal fever, an infection that could set in after birth, was incredibly high due to unsterile conditions. Women who survived the immediate trauma of childbirth might succumb to fever days or weeks later, leaving behind orphaned infants and grieving families. Maternal mortality rates were incredibly high, often estimated to be anywhere from 10 to 30 deaths per 1,000 live births, significantly higher than in later centuries. This meant that a woman had a very real chance of dying with each pregnancy. For many, motherhood was a constant dance with death, a sacrifice that was expected and often idealized as a woman's ultimate purpose, yet it carried the most profound personal risk. And even if the mother survived, the struggle was far from over. Infant and child mortality rates were shockingly high. A significant percentage of children did not survive their first year, succumbing to diseases, malnutrition, or accidents. Many more died before reaching adulthood. Imagine the profound emotional toll this took on women. Carry a child for 9 months, endure a perilous birth, only to watch that child sicken and die shortly after, perhaps repeatedly. This constant cycle of hope, pain, and loss was a heavy burden, a form of emotional servitude to the precariousness of life itself. Scholars of demography for the Middle Ages often point to these high mortality rates as a key factor shaping family structures and societal expectations for women, effectively making them vessels for reproduction above all else. Furthermore, a woman's value in medieval society was often tied to her fertility and her ability to produce healthy offspring, especially male heirs. If she was unable to conceive, or if her children died, she could face immense social stigma, even accusations of barrenness being a sign of divine displeasure. This placed immense pressure on women to endure the constant risks of pregnancy and childbirth, lest they be seen as failing in their fundamental role. Biological reality of reproduction, therefore, was not a source of empowerment, but a deeply dangerous and often tragic form of servitude, dictating the course of a woman's life and often its bitter end. Number 4, the shackles of illiteracy and limited education. Imagine a world where the vast majority of knowledge was locked away from you, written in scripts you couldn't decipher, discussed in circles you couldn't enter. For most women in 1145, the ability to read and write was a rare privilege, almost entirely outside their grasp. This pervasive illiteracy was not merely an inconvenience. It was a profound form of intellectual servitude, a deliberate barrier that denied them access to learning, curtailed their social mobility, and confined them to a narrow, predetermined role in society. It meant that their understanding of the world was often limited to what they heard, saw, and were told, rather than what they could discover for themselves. In the High Middle Ages, education was largely the domain of the church and the nobility, and even then, it was primarily for men. Monasteries and cathedrals served as centers of learning, where monks and clerics studied theology, philosophy, Latin, and law. Lay schools, where they existed, were almost exclusively for boys who were destined for clerical careers or for the sons of wealthy merchants and nobles. The idea of widespread literacy, particularly for women, was simply not a societal priority. Indeed, it was often seen as unnecessary or even dangerous. A literate woman might be considered too independent, too questioning of established norms, or too exposed to potentially subversive ideas. For peasant women, the idea of formal education was an utter fantasy. Their lives were consumed by physical labor and survival, as discussed earlier. Their education came through observation and participation in daily tasks, learning how to cook, spin, weave, farm, and care for children from their mothers and other women in the community. This practical knowledge was vital for survival, but it offered no path to intellectual growth or social advancement beyond their station. They learned the rhythms of the seasons, the lore of the village, and perhaps the basic prayers taught by a local priest, but the wider world of written knowledge remained a closed book. Even among noblewomen, literacy was far from universal. While some high-ranking women, particularly those destined to manage large estates or become abbesses in convents, might receive some instruction in reading and writing, often in Latin, it was the exception rather than the rule. Their education was typically focused on managing a household, overseeing servants, basic accounting, and perhaps rudimentary medical knowledge for the family. Purpose was to equip them for their roles as managers of the domestic sphere or as spiritual leaders within a religious order, not for intellectual pursuits for their own sake. They might be taught to read devotional texts or illuminated manuscripts, but rarely to engage in critical thought or scholarly debate. Historical studies of medieval education, referencing sources like charters and court records, consistently show a vast disparity in literacy rates between men and women across all social strata. The implications of this widespread illiteracy were profound. Without the ability to read, women could not access legal documents, interpret religious texts for themselves, or engage with philosophical or scientific ideas. They were entirely dependent on others to read and explain the written word to them, leaving them vulnerable to misinterpretation or manipulation. Their understanding of the world was filtered through the perspectives of men priests, fathers, husbands, and lords, who controlled the narrative and the dissemination of knowledge. This limited their agency and their capacity to challenge the existing power structure. Social mobility for women was severely curtailed by this lack of education. No access to the professions, to law, to governance, or even to the more advanced trades, women were locked into their predetermined social roles. A woman born a peasant would almost certainly die a peasant. A noblewoman's life was defined by her family's status and her strategic marriage, not by her intellectual prowess or acquired skills. The only significant path to a life of learning for women was through the convent, where nuns might learn to read, copy manuscripts, and engage in theological study. However, this path came with its own set of renunciations and strictures, effectively a different form of servitude, and it was only accessible to a privileged few who could afford the dowry required for entry. The reality for the vast majority was an existence circumscribed by the boundaries of the unwritten word, a life lived in intellectual shadows, with no means to illuminate their own path. Number 3, the lack of legal identity and rights. Imagine a world where you were not truly considered a person in the eyes of the law, where your existence was largely defined by your relationship to a man, your father, your husband, or your lord, and where your voice, your desires, and your property were effectively absorbed into theirs. For women in 1145, this was not an abstract concept, but a harsh, pervasive reality. They lacked a distinct legal identity, possessing very few rights of their own, which positioned them in a profound state of legal servitude. This meant they could not own land, enter contracts, initiate legal action, or even control their own bodies without male oversight, severely limiting their autonomy and leaving them vulnerable. The heart of this legal powerlessness was the concept of coverture, a legal doctrine that, while more fully developed in later common law, had its roots firmly planted in medieval custom and feudal practice. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was effectively covered by that of her husband. She became feme covert, meaning she lost many of the limited legal rights she might have had as a single woman, feme sole. Property, whether inherited or acquired, typically passed into her husband's control. He could manage it, sell it, or lease it without her consent. Any debts she incurred or contracts she attempted to make were generally not legally binding without his approval. If she earned wages, those wages were legally his. This meant that a married woman essentially ceased to be an independent legal entity. She was an extension of her husband. This lack of legal standing had profound implications for her life. A woman could not typically initiate legal proceedings in her own name. If she had a grievance, whether it was a theft, an assault, or a contractual dispute, it generally had to be brought by her male guardian or husband. If she was a victim of a crime, the injury was often considered to be against her male protector's property or honor, rather than against her person directly. This made obtaining justice incredibly difficult and often impossible, as her own testimony was often deemed insufficient or biased. Records from medieval courts, like those analyzed by historians of medieval law, consistently show how infrequently women appeared as independent litigants, and when they did, it was usually in specific, limited contexts like dower claims or as widows. Ownership of land was another critical area where women's rights were curtailed. Land was the primary source of wealth and power in feudal society. While a woman might inherit land from her family if there were no male heirs, or receive land as part of her dowry, control of that land almost invariably passed to her husband upon marriage. He then became the feudal tenant, responsible for fulfilling the obligations to the lord. If he died, she might be granted dower, typically 1/3 of the marital land for her lifetime, but this was for her sustenance and was not full ownership. Even then, she might face challenges from her husband's male relatives who wished to seize the land. The concept of a woman independently owning and managing significant estates was rare and usually only occurred in very specific circumstances for widowed noblewomen who successfully asserted their rights. Furthermore, women generally could not hold public office, serve in the military, or participate in the political processes of the time. While queens and noblewomen might exercise power through their male relatives or in times of regency, this was power by proxy, not power granted by their own legal identity. They were excluded from the councils, courts, and assemblies where decisions were made. Even the church, a powerful institution, largely excluded women from positions of authority and decision-making, though they could enter convents and become abbesses, wielding spiritual and administrative power within those cloistered communities. The cumulative effect of this lack of legal identity was a constant state of dependence and vulnerability. A woman's freedom was contingent on the benevolence or self-interest of the men who controlled her life. She could not easily escape an abusive marriage, challenge an unfair inheritance, or protect herself from exploitation if her male protector failed to do so. Her very existence was legally entwined with, and largely subservient to, the men in her life. This was a form of systemic servitude, deeply embedded in the laws and customs of 1145, ensuring that a woman's autonomy was a rare and fleeting notion. Number 2, forced marriages and the absence of choice. Imagine having the most pivotal decision of your life, the person you would spend every waking moment with, the one who would determine your status, your children's future, and your very home, decided entirely by others. For most women in 1145, this was not a hypothetical scenario, but a deeply ingrained social reality. Marriage was not primarily about love or personal choice. It was a transactional alliance, a strategic maneuver of families and lords to consolidate power, secure wealth, or forge alliances. For women, this often meant a complete absence of agency in selecting their own spouses, resulting in a profound form of personal servitude to the will of their male guardians. From a young age, the daughters of noble families were viewed as valuable pawns in the intricate game of feudal politics. Their marriages were meticulously negotiated, sometimes years in advance, between powerful fathers, uncles, or even the king. A young woman might be betrothed to a man she had never met, someone significantly older, or someone from a rival family, all to serve her family's strategic interests. Personal feelings, her desires, or her compatibility with her prospective husband were rarely, if ever, considered relevant. Focus was on the dowry she brought, the land she would connect, or the political connections she would secure. Chronicles from the time, including those detailing the lives of medieval queens and princesses, frequently mention marriages arranged for reasons of state, with the women having little say in their destinies. Even for women of the peasant class, marriage was often arranged, though perhaps with less grand political aims. Parents would seek suitable matches within the village or neighboring communities to ensure the continuity of their landholding, to combine resources, or to simply secure a partner who could provide labor for their farm. While there might be more opportunity for a peasant woman to know her prospective husband, her ultimate consent was often overridden by familial pressure and the need for economic stability. A woman who defied her parents' choice risked severe social ostracism, destitution, and the loss of her family's support, which was tantamount to a death sentence in a society with no safety nets. The church, while theoretically requiring consent for a valid marriage, often interpreted consent in a way that offered little real protection to women. It might be a silent nod, a forced yes, or simply a lack of overt refusal. Power dynamics were such that open defiance of a father or lord could have severe consequences. Child marriages, where girls as young as 12, the canonical age of consent for marriage for girls were wed, were not uncommon, especially among the nobility. Imagine being a child, barely understanding the world, suddenly bound to a man who was a stranger, often much older, and expected to immediately fulfill the duties of a wife, including bearing children. Once married, a woman was legally and socially bound to her husband. Divorce, as we understand it today, was virtually impossible. Annulment, which was the only way to dissolve a marriage, was rare and difficult to obtain, requiring proof of consanguinity, pre-contract, or other specific impediments, and was typically only accessible to the wealthy and powerful. For the vast majority, marriage was a lifelong commitment, regardless of happiness, abuse, or incompatibility. She was expected to be subservient, to bear children, and to manage the household. Her identity became subsumed into that of her husband's family. This absence of choice extended beyond the initial marriage contract. If a woman was widowed, particularly if she held significant property, or was still of childbearing age, she might be quickly remarried by her lord or her male relatives to secure the continued control of her lands or for new political alliances. Her dower rights and even her children could be leveraged as part of these new arrangements. She rarely had the freedom to choose to remain single or to select a new husband on her own terms. The decision of who she married was seldom hers, effectively making her a perpetual subject of the wills of men, her life course dictated by alliances she did not forge and destinies she could not escape. Her body, her future, and her very existence were seen as commodities to be traded and controlled, a fundamental and deeply personal form of servitude. Number 1, the weight of social stigma and religious condemnation. Imagine living in a world where your very nature, simply because you were born female, was seen as inherently flawed, morally suspect, and even dangerous. For women in 1145, this was a pervasive and oppressive reality. Medieval society, heavily influenced by the Christian Church's interpretation of Scripture, burdened women with immense social stigma and religious condemnation. They were viewed as the inheritors of Eve's sin, prone to temptation, morally weaker than men, and often associated with earthly desires and carnal sin. This pervasive negativity created a psychological and social servitude, diminishing women's self-worth, justifying their subjugation, and limiting their perceived value to little beyond their reproductive and domestic functions. The story of Eve and the Garden of Eden played a central role in shaping medieval attitudes towards women. Eve was cast as the original sinner, the one who succumbed to the serpent's temptation and led Adam, and thus all mankind, into sin and expulsion from paradise. This narrative was relentlessly preached from pulpits, woven into theological texts, and embedded in popular culture. Women were therefore seen as daughters of Eve, inherently weaker in spirit, more susceptible to temptation, and a potential source of moral downfall for men. This negative stereotype permeated every aspect of life. Scholars studying medieval theology and social texts consistently find references to women as the weaker vessel, or the gate of the devil. This religious condemnation translated directly into social stigma. A woman's every action was scrutinized through this lens of inherent sinfulness. If she was too outspoken, she was shrewish. If she was too beautiful, she was seen as a temptress. If she was barren, she was seen as cursed. If she strayed from the narrow path of chastity and obedience, she was branded a harlot, an outcast, and often faced severe punishment or social ruin. The shame associated with premarital pregnancy or adultery fell almost entirely on the woman, while the male perpetrator often faced little to no consequence. Her reputation, therefore, was a fragile thing, easily shattered and almost impossible to repair. This pervasive stigma also justified the strict control placed over women. Physical enclosure, her limited public role, and her subjugation to male authority were all rationalized as necessary measures to protect her from her own inherent weakness and to protect men from her potential corrupting influence. Primary value was often tied to her virginity before marriage, her fidelity within it, and her ability to produce legitimate heirs. Beyond these roles, her intellectual or spiritual contributions were often undervalued or overlooked entirely. Even pious women who chose the monastic life were often segregated into separate convents, lest they distract or tempt men. Fear of witchcraft also played a significant role in later centuries, but even in 1145, women who were perceived as unusual, or who had knowledge of traditional remedies, or who were simply ostracized, could face accusations of maleficence or association with dark forces. While large-scale witch hunts were not yet common, the underlying suspicion of women's spiritual power, particularly outside the confines of the church, was present and could lead to isolated instances of persecution or social isolation. Moreover, the double standards were immense. A man's sexual transgressions were often tolerated or dismissed as natural male urges, while a woman's could lead to severe social and legal repercussion. Physical appearance, her fertility, and her moral purity were constantly under judgment, shaping her identity in ways that men rarely experienced. This constant scrutiny and judgment, rooted in religious and societal dogma, was a form of psychological servitude. It forced women to internalize a sense of inferiority, to conform to highly restrictive expectations, and to live in constant fear of social condemnation. It stripped them of their inherent worth, making their existence a perpetual struggle against a negative stereotype They had no power to escape or redefine. Their entire lives were framed by an overarching narrative that positioned them as inherently flawed, serving to justify every other form of bleakness they endured.